Hi there, welcome to the Nitty Gritty Writing Podcast. I'm Simon Cantan.
And I'm Dave Higgins.
And this week we're going to be talking about using beta readers and how to get the most out of working with beta readers. But before we do that, we'll do our usual weekly roundup of what we've been doing this week. And Dave, you can go first.
Okay, once more, another episode of Seven Stones, written, redrafted, edited, polished, and published. I've started looking for concepts for a cover for the next Seven Stones compilation to release that, although I don't have any final ideas yet. So it's trying to find something that keeps with the existing one, but is distinct enough in thumbnail that people don't get confused or anything. What else have I been doing? I'm editing Sorcery, the follow-up to Adventure. So that's the first big chunky edit on the text. And so far, the story's still great. So hopefully that'll be another fun Higgins and Cantan book for you to read later in the year. So I'm about a fifth of the way through that. What else? I think that's about it for this week.
For me, I've been editing Adventure, doing the final edit before it goes out to beta readers. And I think it works really well. Like, we were aiming for something, we were kind of inspired by Princess Bride and that kind of thing. So I think it fits very well into that style of story. Not that will be as good as the Princess Bride, but we hope it'll approach it at least.
It's different from the Princess Bride.
No, it's not like a copy or anything. It's just in the same tone, I guess. And
let's not talk about which is better or worse. They are both great in their own way.
Yeah, and the other thing I've been doing is working on my super secret code project, which a few listeners have been asking, what is it? So in this episode, I'll go into it more since we're going to be discussing beta readers. So yeah, it's been a very kind of tough week because editing is always tough for me. I get bored very easily of editing and just want to go and write another first draft. But I struggle through it. Yeah, so that's about it for me, I think. Oh, and I could mention we're also talking with an artist on 99 Designs about covers for the 3 books in the Dragons and Magic series, Origin, Adventure, and Sorcery. And we got 2 of them mostly nailed down, and we're waiting on the last one. So we'll have them well in advance of release as well. So that's pretty good. Grant, so we'll move on to our topic, which is beta reading. Yep. So I've done kind of a mix of things before. I've had people read the book in advance of it coming out and give me feedback. I've done advanced review copies where some of my readers do like to email me, and I very much appreciate it, and email me and say, hey, you made a mistake on this line, or this doesn't make any sense, stuff like that. But not an official beta reading process until the last month or so, which is where the super secret coding project comes in, which is that coding project is about beta reading. So I'm working on a website that allows authors to put up books and beta readers to read them, and the system tracks everything the beta reader is doing. So it says they turned a page and they're enjoying the book. They flagged an error, a spelling error, a grammar error, boredom, anything they want on this line, all this kind of stuff, which automates the whole thing. So it kind of fits in with my day job in a way. My day job is optimizing factories by tracking things. So we say there's a pizza and it's meant to have 125 grams of cheese on every pizza, and it's got 127, then we adjust things and make it fit. So I've kind of used my knowledge of that in order to put tracking onto a book and say, okay, this page, for instance, is lower rated than the page before it, so something's going wrong in that area. So that's why this topic kind of fits in very well at the moment, because we've just got a bunch of feedback back from the beta readers on that system about Origin, which I won't go into the details of, but yeah, it kind of flags bits that are not as interesting as the rest of the book and spelling errors and things like that. How about you, Dave? What have you done for beta reading in the past?
I've not had much success with my attempts at official beta reading. I've reached out to people. I've gotten had people who seem to have vaguely sensible opinions and are sort of within my core audience say, yes, I'm happy to give it a go. And I'd send the book then, and usually sort of I'll get a 10% response rate from it. And you'll get really good feedback, potentially from one person, but I can never find more than one or maybe two people who will give me feedback that's actually helpful. So, so I tried various points in the process where I actually get potentially the best validation is when I've not really gone for beta reading per se, but gone for just prior to release sanity check, should I release this book? So instead of holding everything up so I get feedback from people on whether the story is good in fine detail, whether it all makes sense, getting the story to the point where I think it's ready to go, and then passing it out to people with the simple question, is this an enjoyable book? And getting back the yes or no. So I'm not getting any data on, well, at this point in the book, you've lost interest, or there's a spelling mistake on page 47. More just, if you bought this book, would you think you'd got a reasonable deal? And then
maybe because it feels less like homework. Like,
yeah,
if you're asking someone to give a lot of feedback, it feels like it's a chore to kind of read the book.
Yeah, there is something I wanted to bring up at some point on ways of getting the feedback. Is that there are two issues here: finding beta readers to do what it is you want the beta readers to do, and secondly, how you get the information. Is your writing app, your beta reading app rather, it's got to sort of press a button and that captures the person's feedback straight away. So it's not quite as utterly non-intrusive as just swiping with your finger on a Kindle, but it's a fairly low impact way of capturing feedback. Whereas, for some people I've beta read for, I've had, at the end of each chapter, they've got 5 or 6 questions. And that captures a lot of information, potentially for them, on things they're worried about, and also gives you a point at which you stop and feedback on that chapter. But also I found I was having to put the book down, stop thinking about the book in terms of how it was flowing, and start thinking about these specific questions, write the answers down, send them off, and then go back to the next chapter. So it was destroying, for me, my understanding of how the book flows as a book. So I think one of the key one of the key points when using beta readers is that if you want someone to do a detailed edit to check every single comma, then that's what they're doing. If you want someone to tell you whether it's an enjoyable book to read, then that's what you're doing. So if your purpose is to get a reader's perspective on it, potentially forego asking those same people questions about whether there were niggly little mistakes. So if they comment on them, that's great. They've chosen to. And you go, well, that was something potentially that broke the flow. But pick one thing you want your beta readers for and focus on that, rather than going, well, I'd like to know about asking about spelling mistakes, asking about how it flowed, asking about this, that, and the other.
I think if you're asking about spelling mistakes or grammar mistakes, that's a waste of beta reading, in my opinion, because that's something that a copy editor or proofreader can do for a price, obviously. But beta readers are more valuable than that. You're talking about someone who is choosing to use their free time to read your book, so they're usually a fan. And if they're a fan, you don't want to give them something that's riddled with errors and they'll get annoyed with. Their job isn't to fix spelling and grammar. That's just going to stop them, and they go, yeah, I'm never going to do that again. That was just annoying. What you want is a book that's so close to perfect grammar and spelling wise that you would put it out normally. But in the story sense, you're not sure if the characters are relatable or there's any boring bits in the story or anything like that. You want to know what a normal reader's experience will be. So when we have our book out when someone has their book out on Amazon, you get nothing unless you can have the KENP pages read. But even that, if you've got more than one reader, that's not going to tell you anything. And even if you've got a single reader on your book, it's only going to tell you how many pages they read on a particular day, and you've no idea if they stopped halfway through and then moved on or whatever they did. So what you need from a beta reader is the experience they're going to get as a reader, as if they've just picked it up on Amazon and started reading. And that hopefully will tell you, okay, I've got a problem on page 10, which is stopping people. It's boring, or it's, doesn't make sense, or whatever it is, because that's going to be worth 100 or 1,000 readers later on that won't get stopped by that problem and will move on. Which is, again, going back to the beta reading experiment we're doing now, we have about 10 people, I think, in the beta reading system, in the beta reading website, on the reader side of things, and 2 of them have finished the book. We only put it up a week ago. It's only a little more than a short story anyway. It's only about 14,000 words. But so only 2 of them have finished. And if, say, the other 8 don't ever finish, that's useful information, because that tells us, okay, there's a problem here where this book isn't interesting enough to even get, like, these are my inner group kind of thing. They're my I call them critical companions after one of them suggested the name. So they're people who really love my books. And if they can't get through it or they don't enjoy it, well, then there's something wrong that we need to fix. Potentially it's not their kind of book, but it should be, because they all like Bitter End, and this is pretty close. So I think that's probably the most valuable thing, is knowing when people give up reading, which is something that a normal beta reading process tends not to capture. Like my experience as a reader, I was in Garrett Robinson's beta read of, what's the book called again? The Rockstar.
Rebel Yell.
Sorry?
Rebel Yell?
Rebel Yell, that's right. So I was beta reading Rebel Yell, and Garrett had questions at the end of each chapter, and then he was talking to me on an email because I was sending him detailed essays about things in the book. And he said there was only 2 or 3 people who were giving detailed emails. There was about 7 to 10 people who were sending him back "it's fine" kind of email at the end of each chapter. It's fine, moving on. And then he'd asked 50 people, I think, or more. So that's potentially 4/5 of the people who are reading who weren't giving him any feedback. So he has no way then of knowing, did they start the book? Did they stop because they didn't like it? Did they get the whole way through, really love it, and never tell him? It's impossible to know, which is then you're back to the Amazon situation where you get no feedback at all, other than maybe a review if someone finishes it. Like I've always thought that Amazon reviews for longer books will tend to skew higher than for shorter books, because if someone hates a book, they're not going to finish a 150,000 word book if they hate it. Well, a few people might, just to punish themselves. But if it's a quick read, if it's an hour-long read, a lot more people are going to finish that, even if they don't really like it, and then leave a 1-star review, than on a really long book. So at least I would guess. I mean, like even if something is dire, if I see that it's only got 10 minutes left in it, well, I'll just finish it. Who cares? If something has 20 hours left, I'm not going to keep reading it. So I would think, and this is only guessing, that Amazon reviews, which are your best gauge, if you haven't got feedback of every page, they're your best gauge of what people like, will tend to skew higher for longer books, and will definitely skew higher for sequels. Like my bitter end books, the first one is way lower than it's at a 4 or 3.9 some days. Whereas the others tend to be close to 5 stars, because why would you buy the sequel if you don't like the original? Which means that then you would have to disappoint the fans of the books in order to muck up a sequel. So you kind of don't have any feedback in terms of reviews, in my opinion. Like a certain kind of rough idea. So your beta readers are kind of your way of finding out what the real situation is.
Yeah.
We had a question on this subject from Colin Moby. Colin said, beta reading, do you use it? I paid for a read with my first book, from which I got some great feedback, but I like to build up a core group that will give me timely feedback before publishing. If you do use it, when do you send stuff out? First draft would be great for initial reactions, but there's a risk there, especially if your first drafts are like mine. But by third, fourth draft, things are fairly set. So I have 2 mailing lists to start with. So I've got my general readers list telling them what I've been up to that month, that kind of thing, and when there's a new book out. And then I've got, as I said, my critical companions, which is 40 people who tend to be people who email me on a fairly regular basis, like a few times a year at least. So they're actually interested in me as an author and kind of seeing more behind the scenes kind of stuff. So they'd be the group that I would send any beta reading stuff to, or they get all the review copies, things like that. So that's for the first question. Dave, what about you on the groups, mailing lists and things?
I've only got the one mailing list for when I'm releasing something. So I don't have a separate beta reader group, because I haven't been able to find people who are that interested in my stuff that they'd make a good go-to person for beta reader who I don't know already. So having a separate mailing list for them would be pretty much like putting a couple of my contacts into a list where I could just email them anyway. So it's easier to do that. In terms of when to send it, I agree that first drafts are not a great thing to send out to anyone else. I'm very much in favor of writing first drafts on the expectation you're never going to show anyone, because then that gives you the freedom to do whatever you want. If you get to a scene that doesn't work in your head at that moment, but you think you need it, you could just write out something that doesn't really make sense, but kind of gets you there, get your flow going again, and then fix in the second draft, get rid of all of those things that you know don't work. Because there's no point in getting a beta reader to go, this scene doesn't work, if you know it already. Beta readers are there to give you another perspective. So the earliest would be after a second draft. And I can see Colin's point about wanting the feedback before you've got too locked in. So the end of a second draft is a good time. I think potentially the point at which you think the story is good.
I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I would tend not to be. So what tends to happen is that I will create something in any way, like say do a book cover or something like that. And I will think it's like I had a book cover for Blood Cruel, and I will think it's pretty good. And then I will show it to someone whose opinion I trust, who will give me an honest opinion. And my opinion will change based on their feedback. And I won't be as married to it, because if it's something I've just made, like just that second, then I'm kind of, a little bit attached to it. If I wait 2 weeks, I don't really care. If they say it's complete crap, I'll go, yeah, it is pretty crap, all right. Not that I'll just be wishy-washy, but so I guess the key thing is not to be too married to the story at the point at which people are beta reading it. That if someone says, I don't like this character, well, that's a pretty major problem. But to be at the stage where you could go, well, I can either change the character. Usually, if they don't like a character, it's because there's no motivation behind the character or something. But you need to be at a point where you're willing to listen to people's feedback and say, yes, I will change the story based on that. Otherwise, there's no point in asking for the beta reading, unless all you want is affirmation saying this is good. And in that case, you don't really want beta reading as much as just a thumbs up from your spouse. So yeah, I would say that I would only give something out. So beta reading is different from alpha reading. Alpha reading, you could give out a first draft, but you have to be very clear to someone that this is clunky and isn't going to make sense at times, and the grammar and spelling are going to be atrocious and all that kind of stuff. And really, I don't think I'd inflict that on anyone, no matter how enthusiastic they might be. I know that they would not be enthusiastic after seeing a first draft. They go, oh, is this really what a first draft looks like? So for me personally, I don't think I'd ever give anything out until I was ready to publish it anyway. And then I want to find out what's wrong before it goes into the kind of untracking void that is Amazon, where you don't know what's happening. So yeah, for me, that'll be fourth draft. Was there any other bits?
I think we covered Colin's.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, essentially, beta reading is a substitute for content editing. The only thing being that it's a slightly different. So, a content editor will tend to be an expert on fixing story, whereas beta readers will only be able to tell you there is something wrong. So beta readers will say, I was bored here, whereas a content editor would say, you're not setting up your character's motivation correctly, so therefore people are going to get bored here. But personally, I would prefer to have more opinions than less. Like, a content editor is one person's opinion. Granted, they're an expert, but even so, they might not particularly like the genre or not like your writing style or whatever it happens to be. Whereas if you've got 10 people and they all tell you something, then you're pretty certain there's an actual issue there. The other thing I was going to mention, which is just an idea I've had, so it's, I guess, a little bit of a brainstorm.
Mm-hmm.
So what I thought of doing, and it won't be anytime soon, was putting 10 product descriptions up and allowing my readers to vote on them and say the top 5, for instance. Which are the top 5 most interesting? Then I take those product descriptions and write the first chapter for each of those 5. Just 2,000 words for each of the 5, and then put them up and allow people to vote on them. And then that there it's a form of beta reading in that your product description is going to tell you whether something is actually going to sell any copies. If people click on something and say this is the most interesting, that's most likely to sell copies. And then the first chapter is the one that people are going to sample and then go, oh, this is good, I like it, I'll buy it. So that would enable quite a lot of experimentation where you can't do that with a full book. Like if you write a 60,000, 100,000 word novel and then put it out for beta reading, and people don't like the concept or don't like whatever it is about it, you're kind of stuck. I mean, if it's just the first chapter, this didn't hook me or something, that's something you can fix. But if they say, yeah, the whole thing doesn't work, and enough people say that, then you're stuck with a book that's not going to sell anything. So one potential way of using beta reading would be in that way, to write a piece of the book and find out if people are actually going to read it. What are your thoughts on that, Dave?
That's intriguing. You'd have to be. It would have to be something that didn't have foreshadowing, potentially. So it's because, and if you try to do it with a mystery novel, where you're setting things up from the start, writing the first chapter, you might as well write the whole book. But for something where the first chapter can set up the characters without having to actually set anything in stone for the plot, yeah, you could write a first chapter and then, if people liked it, tweak. And you'd have to tell them going in that potentially the first chapter they loved was only a draft, so it might not be the first chapter of the published book, but that could work.
I mean, the thing is as well that you could do that in lots of different ways. So what tends to happen is that the cover is the most important thing about a book in terms of selling, and then the product description, and then the first line, and then the first page, and then the first chapter. And then once you got past that point, you tend to have people hooked if you've done it correctly, as long as you don't mess up and start changing genre or something halfway through, or kill off the main character or whatever it happens to be. So my thought was to kind of use people as a tool to kind of learn as an author. Like what always gets quoted is the first line of 1984. The clocks were just striking 13 as, I forget it, but yeah. That immediately people go, striking 13, that's strange. Why is it striking 13? And that intrigues them enough to read, and then they start getting into the book. Like you want some kind of intrigue and hooking people and things like that, but that's not necessarily something easy to learn how to do. So potentially you could have a beta reading process that's not for an entire story, but is a way of people telling you what they want to read. So for them, the upside is if they already like you as an author, they're kind of steering you towards the kind of book they want to read. So instead of you coming out in 3 months' time or a year's time, whatever it happens to be, with a book that they don't like, they could have a book that they actually really like in their hands, ready to read. I did have feedback actually, just from one reader, I mean, saying that they'd like to do that. So I mentioned it in a previous email. I said, what would people like as a kind of a way to kind of connect, or something to do on the emails every month? And one thing I mentioned was charity or book giveaways or whatever. And then one of them was a kind of collaborative way of making a book, where I suggest things and people vote on them and things. And one person at least wrote back and said they'd love to do that. I don't know whether that was just that the other people didn't bother, or whether only 1 out of 1,000 wants to do that, but it might be a thing to do. Anyway, was there anything else you wanted to add on beta reading in general, Dave?
Yeah, I think it's something that you touched on when you were talking about covers, and maybe something that you touched on when you were talking about not just giving it to your family to get a thumbs up, that it has to be someone you trust to give you feedback of the right kind. And your friends are probably going to agree to read your book, but your friend, how many of your friends can you honestly trust to tell you that your book is terrible? And how many of your friends, if they tell you your book is terrible, are you going to be able to take that on board without it damaging the friendship? So if you have the kind of relationship with someone, be it a family member or a friend, where you can trust them to tell you the complete truth about it in a way that isn't going to damage the friendship, then that's possibly the best feedback you're going to get, because it's someone you trust. So you know if you hand them the book, they're going to do it. But also, having that person, then most of our friends we trust, but we also trust them to put a positive spin on life to support us. So there's no shame in not having any friends who will give you the utter unvarnished truth. They're friends, not professional readers. But so don't feel bad about excluding your friends because you decide, well, I've decided to put my social relationships above this book, that I'm actually going to only get feedback from strangers. But on the other hand, don't buy into the idea that you can't have your friends and family be as good beta readers. Because if you've got the right relationship with them, it doesn't matter how you know them.
I think it's about clarifying it to people. So, for instance, some people will volunteer that you're not very good at something that you don't really care about. So they might, like I cycle to work. Someone might say, oh, you're cycling very slow. Okay, so I don't really care how slow I cycle. I don't care about my cycling form. I don't need cycling clothes. It's my transportation. So it's about clarifying to them that writing is something you want to do as a professional and therefore should be judged on a professional level.
Yeah. And
that's a thing that's very easy to say to someone, but very difficult to convince them of. So I've had, so my friend Jeff, who you've met before on the brainstorming group, before I forget what it was. There was something about the first book, The Bite on the Line. And whatever it was, it may have been the title, it may have been the cover or something. I'd forget. Anyway, whatever it was, he said, yeah, that's good about that thing. And then I got feedback on reviews or from, random strangers through email or whatever that said, hey, this thing isn't good. And then I went back to him and was saying, like, I wasn't saying, hey, why did you say it was good? I said, oh, these people were just mentioning that this thing wasn't very good and blah, blah, blah. He said, yeah, I noticed that too. I went, well, why didn't you told me it was good? Why didn't you tell me it was bad? And he said, oh, well, because I didn't think you wanted to know that. So from that point forward, which is three years ago now, he's been perfect as a person to get feedback from, because he knows I'm not going to get offended. I'm going to be grateful when he says something's bad. As long as it's not everything's bad, you have to have some kind of leeway in things. But that it doesn't matter if you say something's bad. I'm not taking it personally.
Yeah.
And by the same token, I try and give the same to him. Like, he's trying to write a book, although it's been 3 years, so maybe, not trying all that hard. So I try to give the best feedback I can to him on his writing process and say, well, it's about getting it finished and it doesn't really matter. At this stage, it's not about the quality as much as it's getting it done and moving on. So yeah, you're totally right that it is possible. It's just difficult. It's because people will not believe you when you say you want the honest truth. They'll still think, yeah, but you want kind of 10% truth, or you want me to soften the blow, and by softening the blow, they're kind of not doing you any favors.
Yeah.
But if you can convince them, then they're very useful because it's someone you can talk to all the time.
Yeah.
Whereas a normal reader, you can't bug them the whole time, sending them emails saying, what do you think about this? What do you think about this?
Yeah. I mean, it's probably why you spent so long talking with Garrett about Rebel Yell. You had an existing relationship. Potentially, if that was the first book of his you'd read, you hadn't interacted with him at all prior to that, he would have put you in this person gives good feedback, so I'll probably want to talk to them again. He wouldn't necessarily have emailed you in response to every one of yours, and then every time you emailed you back again, and had long conversations, if that was your first interaction.
Oh, I mean, I wouldn't have sent the same essay-like emails to him because I would have assumed that he would not want harsh feedback. And to be honest, he didn't want it as much as I was giving it. Because he did do a vlog where he was complaining that a beta reader was giving him a lot of negative feedback that he appreciated, but it was a bit too much. So I don't know, I guess my tendency is to try and help people by telling them everything that's wrong, whereas I should be mentioning more of what's going right. I guess I'm not very good at giving that kind of feedback.
It's the feedback sandwich. And you tell them good things as well as bad things, and also that's possibly that's possibly a good thing to remember about beta readers. They're not professionals. And I went to university for many years. I did courses in how to express arguments. I went to court on a regular basis for many years, expressing arguments professionally. And I still sometimes accidentally offend people by expressing a point that they think is perfectly valid in a way that they think means something different from what I think. So if you're using beta readers, possibly stick up a big notice on top of your monitor or whatever, telling you they're probably not trying to insult you. So if you get this feedback and your first thought is, that's a personal attack, stop and think, well, this person is not a professional critic. This person does not spend their life doing this as a job. Am I misinterpreting because they're not trained in formal rhetoric?
Oh, almost guaranteed.
Yeah.
I would say most people tend to go to extremes on any kind of feedback, assuming that there's no one behind the computer.
Yeah.
That what they're typing is going into the void and is not going to hurt anyone's feelings.
Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast today, I think it was AuthorBiz, but it might have been something else, where someone was saying that they always try and kill negative thoughts with kindness. So they got an email from someone saying they write kind of puerile comedy books. It sounded, from the sounds of what they were describing, wasn't a million miles from Green Star. Anyway, so they said they got a email saying, this is completely puerile, it's just toilet humor, and I hate it. And they wrote back and to the person and said, I completely understand. Humor is very subjective, and one person's toilet humor is another person's, perfect humor. Thank you very much for writing. Your feedback is very important, and I really appreciate it. You taking the time, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that person then wrote back and said, you're right. Humor is subjective. So I've recommended your book to my nephew and his friend, and they actually love it. So out of that killing with kindness feedback, the person who was reading didn't enjoy it and was never going to enjoy it, but they then recommended it to someone who would.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of the way to think of it. So yeah, we've come to kind of the end of our usual time.
Yep.
Was there anything you wanted to add just at the end, Dave?
Don't think so. No, I think we've covered the topic. Nothing's popped up that. It's great. So no, I think I'm good.
Grant. Thank you all very much for listening or watching, and we will see you on the next one.